hectic, as you've all seen. So thanks to both him and Karen for their patience and perseverance, because we weren't able to resolve it our side. So it's only their efforts that have gotten us here. So without a further ado, I'm going to ask Professor Conor O'Toole, who's an Associate Research Professor at ERSI and an Adjunct Associate Professor at Trinity College Dublin. His research covers the areas of macroeconomics, banking, and the housing market. He's co-editor of ESRI's quarterly economic commentary and has published in a number of leading academic journals, such as the Journal of Money, Credit and Banking, Review of Finance, and the Journal of Housing Economics. Prior to joining the ERSI, Conor worked as a manager of the macro financial linkages team in the Central Bank of Ireland. And with that, Conor, are you okay? Just your slides working?
They aren't yet now, but just give me 1 second to see if I can find them. Oh, yes, here they are. Can let me know if
yeah, if you just make them.
Guys can see that, yeah. Okay, great. Is that coming through on your side?
Thank you, Conor.
Okay, great. So thanks everybody, and in particular thanks to Wayne and Simon Community for the invite. My apologies again for the technical issues at the start here, but I had difficulties logging into the Zoom network. Zoom was being sneaky on me, getting me to register. So now that that's all resolved, thank you everybody for your patience, and I hope you take something from the talk today. So what I'm hoping to do is to provide the current Irish economic outlook as kind of we in the ESRI's macro team see it, and then to try and kind of drill down then into the housing market implications of that macro context. So in a sense, I'm going to be talking quite generally about developments, about how we've done over the past number of years through the pandemic, what the 12 months ahead can look like, where do we see the macroeconomy going, and then trying to provide some context as to how we feel these various macroeconomic channels that are kind of heating up may feed down through into the housing market, in particular on the demand and supply sides of the housing market. So let me start by at the broadest possible context. So over the period of the pandemic since 2020, despite the major economic disruptions at a very high macro level, Ireland really has posted some remarkable macroeconomic numbers. You know, throughout 2020, even with the very stringent public health measures that were required to manage the COVID-19 infection, despite the domestic economy having very, very severe limitations on people's ability to spend money and huge uncertainties for businesses and closures for businesses, we posted positive GDP numbers, and really we were the only country in out of many European comparators to do that. So we really were an outlier in that context. And you can see in the little forecast chart here that I have, the little box on the top of the screen, the GDP, which is a measure of the goods and services in the economy, that grew by 6% last year. Sorry, in 2020, and then grew by a further nearly 14% in 2021. So really the economy has weathered, in a macro sense, the storm. Why is that? Well, really that is down to the multinational activities. So in Ireland, we have this huge multinational sector, which, causes our macro numbers to really go up and down. And what we saw in 2020 in particular, and through into 2021, was the export channel. Multinational exports really kept up. And that wasn't all to do with some of the more globalization factors that have been put forward around the national accounts, for example, some of the more distortive things. This was actually because we had big multinational firms in the type of sectors that just seemed to be invariant to the effects of COVID. For example, the pharmaceutical sector, for example, computer services sectors. So these are really big firms producing proper goods and services that we would in the Irish economy and selling those abroad. So it really was quite a remarkable picture. But we can see the scars of the crisis on the Irish economy very clearly. The second column in the little chart there is modified domestic demand. So this strips out the activities of the multinational and focuses really on the domestic economy. So household spending, business investment on non-distortive type of goods and services by businesses, and government spending. And we can see very clearly that dropped off in 2020. And we did see growth in 2021, which is quite strong. The rebound was there. And in 2022. So I guess the best way to describe the performance over the period was the macroeconomy grew strongly, but we do have evidence of quite a considerable shock to domestic demand. And in particular, you can see that through household spending, which I'll talk about in particular. The outlook for this year is strong. We do see with the unwinding of the public health measures and the return to more normalized economic activity, we do see a strong economic forecast for this year. That's both in our modified version of the domestic economy, but also in the general economy. So we are expecting the economy to grow strongly this year. There are a number of risks to that, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, but we do expect the outlook for the economic growth situation to be very strong, which is quite notable. One of the things that I would point out is obviously with the very strong macro growth, in a sense, what that did was it bought us a bit of space through the pandemic to be able to introduce the policy supports that were targeted at households and businesses to get through the disruptive period. And the rebound in the taxation receipts as the unemployment rate has dropped off has helped us to have resources available to be able to support households. But also the fact that multinational activity stayed, corporation tax rose through the pandemic, allowed us to have funds to be able to bolster the sectors and the households affected by the domestic economy. So I think that's, or by the COVID shock. So I think that's an important point to make. So what I'll do is maybe I'll talk through a couple of the specific aspects of the macroeconomy that kind of tell the story of what's happened through the pandemic, focusing on consumption. So that's household spending on goods and services. This really is the best lens, or one of the two best lenses into what's happening on the ground. And we can see 2020, we had a dramatic drop in consumption expenditures. And that makes sense, as many households weren't able to spend their income because of the public health restrictions. But also, one of the quite remarkable features of the Irish economy was the huge increase in the savings ratio. So you can see the chart here shows Ireland in the blue, the light blue line, and it shows the other European countries in the dark blue line and the green line. The savings ratio in Ireland increased dramatically above other European countries. So basically, incomes didn't fall as much as spending fell, and that effect was greater in Ireland than in other countries. So this is what given rise to what we in our commentaries and what others have mentioned about this savings glut. So many households have been building up these excess savings because their incomes didn't adjust to the extent that their consumption adjusted during the public health period. And this has a number of effects, which we'll talk about in the future. One, it can provide a demand stimulus, so it can provide an economic stimulus. So if households decide over the next number of periods to start unwinding those savings balances, that'll provide further domestic economic stimuluses across the board. The other risk, which I'll talk about in the kind of housing section, is that these savings could feed their way through into the housing market if households are using them to finance or to co-finance house purchase, or even home improvements, which is one of the ones that we've seen in some of the data. So these savings are a source of demand, a source of economic growth, but the targeting of how households use them, I think is important for how these are unwound. On the investment side, one of the things that is a challenge in Ireland is stripping out the multinational activity from our overall investment, and that's what we do with this modified investment figure here, which takes out some of the more globalized effects. And in a sense, what we've seen is even when we take these out, there has been a drop in investment in Ireland. The uncertainty around businesses being able to commit capital in the current environment is very high. So businesses have stood back from investment activities, in particular in 2020. There was some rebound in 2021, but the business closures, the uncertainties, the disruptions have led through to lower modified investment. And in a sense, for the housing market situation, these investment are tied into the residential dwellings and the commercial building activity. So I'll talk a little bit more about trends in completions, housing completions, and the investment side. But in a sense, we did see effects of the pandemic, not surprising, but we are expecting this to kick back in strongly this year as companies become a little bit more certain about the environment, as the epidemiological situation allows a more normalized economic transition to recovery. We do see this as picking up. In terms of the traded side, again, I think one of the most remarkable features of the Irish macroeconomy is the globalized nature of the economy. It is highly globalized. Exports and imports are very large relative to economic activity. And we saw through the pandemic period really strong export growth, and really this was driven by the multinationals. And in a sense, it's even more surprising because through that period we've also had the disruptions from Brexit and the UK leaving the European Union. And despite all of this, the type of sectors that Ireland is active in particular the two I've mentioned, pharmaceuticals and computer services, these really have been allowed Ireland to have an export activity that has held up well through the pandemic period. So certainly, when we wonder how Ireland's economy can have grown through the particular period we've seen, it really is the export channel and the trade channel that has been driving that. Okay, I guess the other lens, I've talked a little bit about consumption. The other lens through how we can best understand developments in the macroeconomy is through the unemployment rate. It is because of the multinationals. The unemployment rate is a really good indicator of what has happened or what is happening on the ground in the Irish economy. And it gives a really good sense of how Irish households are experiencing their labour market conditions. It's a very good lens into how households are faring through the pandemic and through other economic shocks. You can see here the chart in blue here is the traditional unemployment rate, but then obviously when the pandemic hit, the CSO produced this COVID adjusted unemployment rate. And we can see immediately after the pandemic hit, we're talking about 1 in 3 in the labour force being unemployed. And then as the economy reopened through the summer of 2020, that declined again, but then rose back up again in the early part of 2021 as the public health restrictions were required again. But then since then, you can see we've had a very dramatic decline in the unemployment rate. And, we are forecasting for this year, for 2022, that the unemployment rate will drop below 6%. And in a sense, that kind of brings us back to territory that we're nearly back to full employment. And that's it's quite a remarkable transition given the economic shock that we had. So this really does give us a good lens into how the economic picture is playing out on the ground. I guess one of the big items that's come back onto our agenda that we haven't seen in many years is the issue of inflation. So with the inflation rate tipping up throughout last year, it has provided a further economic risk and an economic challenge that's something that we haven't had to analyze or think about for many years. We've had quite a low and stable inflation rate for many years, but now inflation is coming back, and it's coming back in quite considerably. For 2021, there were a number of reasons behind the quite rapid rise in the inflation rate. One being the fact that prices in 2020 had dropped. So the rebound, or these base effects as they call them, was naturally going to happen as there was some recovery in 2021. So that gave some stimulus to price effects. You can see here in the chart here, the drop in prices in 2020 was followed naturally by a rise. But there's been other factors. The international energy market prices are really causing a considerable degree of the inflationary spike that we've seen. And I'll talk a little bit about them on the next slide in detail. But there's these other factors, for example, the disruptions to global supply chains that have occurred from various shutdowns and various pandemic-related disruptions throughout the globe, but also just the swings in demand in economies, both in Ireland and internationally, where you have underutilized services, then with public health restrictions, then you have an increase in demand as these restrictions are lowered. So you have these changes, these price volatility effects. So all of these are kind of leading us into a much higher inflation environment than we have previously had to deal with. Our expectation for 2022 is that have overall inflation of about 4%. You know, when we're thinking about the path for this inflation, and certainly when we were designing our commentary at the end of last year, we saw these inflationary factors peaking in the early months, the first quarter of 2022, and then declining through the rest of the year. That is still our assessment of the position, but I think one of the things we're going to have to watch clearly is that if the domestic economy starts to ramp up considerably, you could have a component of the domestic-led inflationary factors as well as some of these international factors, and that may put more pressure on the price levels, in particular if there's any sort of feedback loop between the inflation we're seeing, in particular from international factors, and domestic wages. If domestic wages begin to increase in terms of wage costs, that can put pressure on the inflationary spiral as well. So I think inflation definitely being one of the big risks, or if not the big risk that we're currently discussing. I won't go into too much detail about the international energy markets. There's the multitude of factors that are affecting the energy price spikes, you know, from the geopolitical tensions to long-term effects like declining investment in oil and gas, to changing demand compositions in Asia and Europe, which are all leading to increased excess demand on energy activities. So there's a range of factors which are all leading to really quite stark increases in prices, and we're all aware of these as we can feel them in our own gas bills and energy bills. So this is definitely a consideration. Okay, so to move on then specifically to what does this housing market, or this macroeconomic context mean for the housing market? Well, it's going to feed back in through both the supply and demand side channels across a range of different factors. It's going to have different effects on private rental and owner occupation in different ways. And what I'm going to try and do is kind of try and talk through the overall trends that we're seeing in both the rental and the housing market, and then to try and discuss in a little bit more detail how some of this macroeconomic context is going to lead in to the different supply and demand factors that we can identify. So this first chart, I think, is sums up what's happening in the house price market, so in the house purchase market. I've run it all the way back to 2006, just to really contextualize where we are now. So obviously there was a major drop in house prices after the financial crisis. There was a recovery. Then there was the introduction of the central bank's macroprudential regulations. And after that, there was a period of was going to drop inflation. And then there was a kind of a stabilization and then a further drop in 2018. That was kind of across the regions. You can see National is in blue here, Dublin is in the red, and the rest of the country is in the green. So you can see there was certainly a moderation in prices in the period preceding the COVID-19 crisis. What we saw then was, as the crisis hit in early 2020, there was a further moderation in price levels. Now that was, I think, kind of what we all expected, in line with the economic shock that we'd experienced. But since then, there has been quite a rebound in prices, and price inflation has been increasing rapidly. Not just in Dublin, in the Dublin market, but the number of months data that we've seen, and this is in line with the stronger recovery that we've seen more generally over the past period. One of the interesting things in terms of understanding the price changes is how many transactions have been happening in the market. So is the change in prices due to market activity declining, so therefore distributional effects, or is it just generally across the board? So what I put up here is the chart of the total number of transactions for the January to November period of every year since 2010. And you can see in 2020, as the pandemic hit, there was quite a marked drop in transactions. And while it has increased this year, so we're saying, so in a sense, some of the price growth from last year can just be the recovery from this year can be the recovery in transactions, so more market activity trying to happen in a short space of time. We still aren't above the level seen in 2018 in terms of the number of transactions. On the supply side, I think it's kind of a well put forward point at this stage on the considerable supply challenges and the need for additional housing. What we have seen is the disruptions to the supply channel because of the pandemic, and that's to be expected. The building sector needed to be closed down due to the public health requirements. So therefore, there was a drop off in the trend of new completions. So we can see that the completion number in 2020, just over 20,000, was below the 2019 number. Now, that's probably, actually, given the shutdowns, it's actually quite notable that we were able to get all the way to over 20,000 units. We hadn't expected that ourselves during the 2020 period. So it is quite a feat to have gotten to that. And the 2021 number, it only includes the first 3 quarters. I was hoping to have the fourth quarter being published today, but I haven't had it. But certainly expect it to have risen again this year. What's interesting is the commencements. It's a good leading indicator for completions. You've had quite a dramatic rise in 2021. So that's certainly a good signal that the supply is starting to come online, and that there's more units going to be becoming available to try and address some of the supply shortages. Okay, so to move from the house purchase market into the rental sector, I think this is one of the areas that we've all seen quite marked rises in prices more recently. These charts come from the rent index from the Residential Tenancies Board that we produce with them on a quarterly basis. You can see the chart here on the left-hand side provides the year-on-year growth rate of the standardized average rent for new rents, that is, not for all existing contracts, but for new rents. And we can see, there was quite a notable dip as the pandemic first hit, and there has been kind of a moderating trend since the first introduction of the RPZs. But this has rebounded, and there has been quite a considerable increase in prices through this year on new rents. And in a sense, that the chart on the right-hand side provides a little bit more regional context here, and you can see that it is, while it is across the board, it is more in the outside Dublin areas. So Dublin had a greater dip during the onset of the COVID pandemic, but there's been a generalized recovery. And I think this is one of the interesting things that we're trying to look at within the kind of regional variation is trying to understand where are these price pressures happening. And this chart shows the annual rate of change in the standardized average rents for new rents from the last index that we produced across counties. And you can see it's many of these smaller rental markets that wouldn't have a huge number of tenancies every quarter, but they're experiencing quite rapid rental inflation at present. And I guess one of the other feature that we've been kind of calling out is that there's been in many of these markets that are seeing rapid inflation, there's a major drop in the number of tenancies that we observe. So these markets appear to be becoming less liquid, so there's less turnover, less activity every quarter. And you know, other reports, other commentaries have shown a huge drop in listings and very tight supply conditions in the rental sector. Okay, so to just try and pull these factors back to both the demand and the supply side. So with the real rebound in the macroeconomy, we see these strong demand side pressures in the housing market continuing. You know, we have high household formation rates for many years, which is putting demographic pressure on the housing market. There's a number of studies which indicate we need about 30 to 50,000 units per annum to stand still. And you know, these pressures will continue for the foreseeable future. Obviously, there's been this increase in housing wealth from savings accumulation, and this is additional stimulus that can be focused into the housing market. The rising incomes and lower unemployment rate, this will support the demand side sector, as will recovery in lending activity that we've seen through the past year. And the point that I like to make about historically low interest rates, this is, you know, in a really long-term context to the low interest rate environment really we've seen since you know, the noughties has been a stimulating factor for house prices in the long run. You know, on the supply side, it's a much more complicated picture to understand. It's a much more, there's a huge amount of aspects to this market. You know, we really need housing supply across the price distribution. So I would always say that all supply is good wherever across the price distribution it has. We need that price. We need any units we can get on the market across the price distribution. You know, given the uncertainties we've had economically, the strong buyer demand and the recovery in the economy should provide more certainty for producers, particularly on the owner occupation market. But I think the big challenge that we have is how do the inflationary pressures we've seen impact on the high construction costs that we have in Ireland, for example, the labour side. Do these resource constraints in the labour market feed through into higher costs for producing housing units? And I think that's really is one of the critical issues that we're going to face. On the supply side, then, you know, we have to think about whether there's shifting patterns of spatial distribution of housing with the pandemic or with changing work patterns, and I think this will be another important point. One point that I do like to make, I'm sorry, I know I'm really going over my time here, but I'm going to wrap up soon, is the relative use of the kind of finite resources that we have. So naturally, if we're all kind of agreed on the requirement to have a large investment in housing, in residential housing, but obviously the resources that are used for residential housing are demanded by other types of activity. For example, home improvements activity, commercial infrastructure investments. So you're the construction sector, which is trying to allocate its resources across all these activities. And I think there's this kind of decisions and prioritization required within that. And to layer on top of all of these issues, we have the further challenge of needing over the coming decade to make considerable investments in our housing and our built environment to manage the green transition. So lots going on in that space. Okay, so to just wrap up, a number of different takeaways. You know, looking at a really strong macroeconomic recovery, this will be experienced on the ground through improving labour market conditions. But there are considerable risks remaining, in particular the inflation risk to the international supply chains and geopolitical factors. And look, I think we're all hoping that the epidemiological situation improves, but we can never rule out further COVID-19 developments and new variants, etc., which may change that requirement, and that risk obviously remains. Certainly, the housing market pressures are likely to remain. We do have considerable excess demand, and I think the key to ensuring that the supply activity is to understand the cost side and to really ensure we can try and get a handle on the cost side when we're trying to drive the supply response. So I'll stop there. I'm more than happy to look forward to the discussion and to answer any questions or comments that people may have.
Thanks for that, Conor. That was really excellent tour de force as always. And I think lots to consider. I think the confluence of factors coming at us in a sense, and I mean that particularly in the context. I agree with you that all supply is good, but I suppose for the Simon perspective, and I think the Irish Council would probably share this, affordability is a critical thing, because without affordability, we're going to see increased homelessness. And increased supply, as we know, doesn't mean increased affordability. It can help. It's important. It's an important factor in it, but it doesn't deliver it. But one of the ways we can deliver it is by taking some of those factors and addressing them through the use of our approved housing body sector. So with that, my neat link there, I am going to welcome Karen Murphy, who, as I said earlier, is the Director of Policy at the Irish Council for Social Housing. Karen's area of responsibility include policy development and strategies to promote the advancement of social housing in Ireland. In addition to liaising with relevant departments and agencies in relation to housing policy, Karen is the Irish Council for Social Housing representative on a number of national committees. She's involved in the development of services to members of the ICHSH, including advice, information and guidance to the 270 housing associations throughout the country, as well as looking at research and education programs, publication and communications. Karen has over 20 years experience working in the not-for-profit sector in Ireland, predominantly in the area of social housing, and her academic qualifications include a Master's in European Social Policy Analysis. So with that, Karen, I hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Wayne, and thanks, Conor, and good morning, everyone. I think, Wayne, thanks again for the invitation. So you asked me to give a response and, to sort of position Conor's analysis. And I suppose there's an awful lot to unpack and to consider, Conor, and what you've presented there, and your analysis is very deep. And very broad, looking at all kind of aspects of the economy and focusing in on housing. So thanks very much for that. I suppose if I was to boil it down, I think what you're saying is the outlook is good, the economy is strong, which has positive impacts for employment, also for exchequer receipts, which is very, very helpful to anyone working in housing and in social housing. But it also carries real risks, and you've mentioned some of the risks there, inflation being one, but I suppose underlying problems and supply constraints within the sort of the market, if you like, or the society generally. But you did use a phrase at the start of your presentation there, and it just struck me. You spoke about the scars of the crisis, and you were talking about the COVID crisis, but I suppose I've been in housing a long time now. And for me, it really resonated, because I thought about, the scars of the housing crisis really are, just not going away. They're getting deeper and deeper and impacting on people's lives, their health, their life chances, their progression. So I think, when you spoke about the scars of the crisis, I think for those of us working in housing, it feels like, that's just a sort of an ongoing, I suppose, backdrop to what we're trying to do. So I did prepare like a short presentation, so I'll start to share that. But I think just as an initial comment, really, it's around so what can we do to, I suppose, help relieve those problems that are causing scars across our society, but also to make the most of what economic bounty is there or is available, to try and make the most of it. So hopefully the screen will share without a glitch. Yep. So hopefully everyone can see that. Great. So I think maybe just, reflecting a little bit what you said, Connor, there, like looking at what is the outlook if you were to read the newspapers.
Sorry, Karen, if you just want to make it full screen.
Full screen, yep. There we go.
Perfect.
Thanks, Wayne. Yeah, so if we were to read the newspapers recently, you'll see different predictions for house price growth in 2020, the coming year, following what Connor has said around that pent-up demand, the pent-up savings. So everything from 8% increase, according to Sherry Fitzgerald, DNG, or slightly higher between 12 and 13. The Society of Chartered Surveyors is saying 5%, but regardless of who you listen to, we are looking at house price growth from a not insignificant base in 2022. So that's something that we have to be very aware of when we're planning our responses. Rental inflation, again, is expected to increase this year also, as Connor mentioned, and tender price inflation, which was running at over 8% last year, and that is expected to continue certainly for the first half of 2022. And all of these are, against the backdrop of these underlying challenges, which is chronic undersupply of housing, strong demand for both rental and ownership, coupled with population growth expected over the next 10 years. As I've said, supply chain issues and tender price inflation all impacting on our ability to respond to, the housing crisis, and this unrelenting affordability gap, which we are trying and close insofar as we can. So I suppose the backdrop that we're coming from, approved housing bodies, is very much operating under the Housing for All plan. And I'm assuming everybody knows or has heard of something about this plan over the last few months. But it is a 10-year plan with 5-year targets and a 5-year funding commitment, which is key really to what the plan brings to the table. It deals with all aspects of housing, not just social housing, but also cost rental, which is a new form of tenure, affordable purchase and private housing. There's so many different aspects to the Housing for All plan. I'm not going to try and cover them all, but there is a particular, challenge and program to deal with the vacancy in our housing stock and trying to reuse existing stock that's already there. There is a commitment to working towards ending homelessness by 2030. That's not the first time we've seen a commitment to ending homelessness, but I suppose there are a number of programs and plans stitched in to try and achieve that. And just to, give you a look at the numbers, where is Housing for All pitched at? Over the next 10 years, it's aiming to develop 90,000 social homes, 36 affordable homes, 18,000 cost rental, and over 150,000 private houses. So, Connor, you spoke about the different predictions of the need. So from 30,000 up to 50,000. But essentially, this is where Housing for All is pitched at. And it averages out at about 33,000 new homes across those different tenures per annum. So, our focus will certainly be on the social housing and the cost rental, but we would hope that all aspects of the plan pan out. As I've said, the plan is very broad, but I suppose there's a number of different levers within it to attack affordability, to try and make housing more accessible for first-time buyers, for example, through the First Home Shared Equity Scheme or the local authority or LDA affordable housing delivery, through to programs like Project Thussey and the Crí Chonaiche schemes, which are aimed at activating sites. There is an increase in planning permissions over 2021, which is very positive, and commencements. But there are, a number of planning permissions which have yet to be activated. So Project Thussey, for example, will be aimed at forward purchase agreements to try and get those schemes up and running and into production. There is a plan for sustained social housing delivery, which we feel is key to try and to bring some stability back into the system, so that we know, so not just for next year or the year after, but for full 10 years, there will be a consistent delivery of social housing of 9 or 10,000 units over that period, as well as the delivery of cost rental homes. So like, that's just a very quick whistle stop tour, but that's the backdrop of where AHBs are coming from in terms of trying to, I suppose, move housing forward as an agenda. So some of the challenges that have been mentioned this morning, you know, what's in place, or what are the strategies for dealing with those? I think the fact that Housing for All itself is a 10-year program with a multi-annual budget guaranteed or attached to it is a huge benefit. And certainly we can see for approved housing bodies, you know, it gives us the confidence to be able to go out to forward plan deals, to seek expressions of interest from the market, not just for the next year, but over 3, 4, 5 years. And that's a sort of a change, if you like, in that multi-annual funding brings that confidence. I suppose the key risks that have been stated, there's the construction sector capacity itself. There's a number of programs aimed at, I suppose, addressing apprenticeship and skills shortage, skills gaps, to try and bring, I suppose, a flexible capacity back into the construction sector. Tender price inflation has been mentioned, is expected to continue for the first half of this year, which we've seen not just in tender price, the material costs, particularly steel, timber, plaster, all of these materials have seen very significant price hikes over the last year. So one of the responses to that has been an amendment to the public works contracts, for example, which will relieve those inflationary pressures on contractors. So that was just agreed in November. So we would hope that that would give us another tool to, I suppose, to deal with those inflationary pressures in the market, that it doesn't reduce contractors basically taking on public works contracts. Some of the other actions, again, I won't go into individual detail, but there's, I suppose, in Ireland, we do think there's room to improve our technologies and innovation in construction delivery. So there's a new construction technology centre planned. There's a huge amount of planning reform underway to try and deal with delays and costs that adds to delivery. Utilities infrastructure requires a significant investment, and that's planned, as well as capacity. So in terms of the role for approved housing bodies, as I've said, like, there is a multi-annual focus, but for AHBs, it's the plan does foresee a central role, and in particular across all areas of social housing for AHB. And that's everything from housing first delivery, traveller accommodation, housing for older people, for people with disabilities, but also this new form of tenure, which is cost rental, aimed at people who are slightly above the social housing income guidelines and really struggling in the private rented sector. So whilst it's a very new scheme, we have already seen delivery and sort of that pipeline being developed already. So the role for AHB is very much focuses on our delivery over the next 5 years, but it does reflect the sort of capacity that we've built up under Rebuilding Ireland. So of the 51,000 social homes that are planned for the next 5 years, almost half, over 23,000, will be social housing by AHBs with cost rental additional to that. So, you know, just I suppose a significant growth we've seen within the AHB sector in recent years, and it's now a regulated sector with a statutory regulator in place, and that's set to continue. That trajectory, we hope, will continue over the next 5 and 10 years. And what that does is provide both access to housing for people on low incomes, security of tenure, and affordable rents. So that's what we want to see. In terms of our pipeline, we have 8,000 units already in construction pipeline at various stages, which we will be adding to. And that's not including programs like the acquisitions, repair and leasing, which tries to regenerate vacant housing, and the cost rental pipeline. So that, I suppose that's the response, and that's how we see ourselves responding under Housing for All, and in particular focusing, for example, on smaller units, 1 and 2 bed, which is particularly helpful in dealing with the growing homelessness. And as a sector, I think our focus is on sustained quality-driven supply to meet and exceed targets, and to try and alleviate, I suppose, some of those affordability pressures and supply gaps for people on lower incomes in particular within the housing sector. So thanks very much for that. I'll end it there, Wayne.
Karen, thanks a million, and thanks to everybody for hanging in there with us. We've run, or we're almost spot on time, but given our technical difficulties, we haven't really that space that we would usually allow for Q&A. But if people want to, if people have an additional 5 minutes, if you want to pop any questions you have into the chat box there, and we can put them, I'm happy to put them to our presenters. And we already, thanks Colette Finn. Does Professor O'Toole agree that the Kenya report recommendation of development land being priced at agricultural price plus 25%? Or do you agree with that? And should this be implemented in the current circumstances?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and you know, I've seen, you know, a lot of kind of references to the Kenya report over the years. I haven't myself looked at how you specifically would parameterize any measure like that. So, for example, the parameterization of the specific markup over the agricultural prices is something you'd have to evaluate in detail. In a sense, I think one of the key issues is trying to get a better understanding of land costs and try and understand, you know, their contribution overall to the market. How you would deal with that. There's been a number of measures introduced more recently, and in a sense, trying to deal with lowering the overall price of land in the market, I think is a key issue. So it's certainly something that you know requires the policy focus. But in terms of the specific measure mentioned in the Kenya report, I'm not sure if that's the specific way to go, if that makes sense. I guess, you know, when you're thinking about all of the inputs into the cost of production, it is a basket of costs that makes sense. And when you think about the potential resource constraints and the inflationary factors that are coming through the macroeconomy at present, it's going to be a range of issues, I think, that on the cost side, not just the land price issue, but the resource constraints, potentially labor costs and materials costs are all in the mix for raising the cost of production. But I certainly think focusing on understanding better the land prices and the impact of land prices on the overall cost is definitely a good idea.
Thanks for that, Conor. Karen, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think land values and land prices are certainly something that we keep a close eye on. It feeds into our own programs, because the more you have to pay for land, the more it reduces your ability to deliver. But there are some, I suppose, aims in Housing for All for a land. I think it's the land value sharing, it's called, which will aim, I think local authorities will be given the power to recapture some of the windfall that occurs to a landowner out of a rezoning or out of planning permissions. So I'm not sure how far it's progressed, but there is this land value sharing, I believe it's called, within Housing for All. So you know, we'd hope to see a sort of a real impact out of that filtering through.
Okay, we've now officially run 5 minutes over. So if people do have any additional questions or questions occur afterwards, if there's email addresses that you would have gotten when you registered, so please do send them on, and we can maybe follow up that way. But in the interim, can I thank wholeheartedly Conor and Karen for their patience and perseverance this morning, and also for the quality of the contributions. I mean, people clearly put a lot of work into them, and I think it's critically important that as we continue to advocate and think about how we can respond to this housing crisis, and particularly to the affordability crisis, and more pointedly to the homeless crisis, this kind of engagement and thinking through these issues is absolutely critical, and particularly for agencies like Simon, who can hopefully rally public support to the solutions to this crisis. So with that, I want to say thank you, and thank you again to everyone who's joined us, and again for your patience in the face of what looked like a bit of chaos at the start. Thanks to everybody, and we'll finish there.
Thank you.
Thank you.